Hello and welcome to Varn Blog. And today I am talking with Jay Rogers, the author of The Fourth Political Theory and Biblical Perspective and the founder of Media House International. And we're going to be talking about the conservative reaction and critique of Alexander Dugin, and particularly from a Protestant Christian perspective, which for my show will be a pretty different viewpoint from what you normally hear, which is a mixture of socialist and socialist Catholics. So how are you doing today, Jay?
Pretty good. How are you doing?
I'm doing well.
And thank you very much for having me on. I really appreciate it. I've been following your Dugan series for quite a while. I think I've seen all of them. I haven't paid really close attention to everything because they're long and sometimes I drift off, but I have watched all of them all the way through. So very interesting.
Yeah, I appreciate that. So I found your take on Dugan particularly interesting because the majority of critiques I've seen of Dugan from other conservatives have been, frankly, neoconservative driven, or even pandering to using him as a figure to demonize Russia or to demonize the Trump administration. And while I'm pretty critical of both the Trump administration and Russia, I have found that to be a particularly dishonest move in discussing Dugan's influence, which is even hard for me to ascertain what it is in Russia itself. It seems, I hear very different things from Russian speakers about whether or not he's of any importance or not. But I was also interested in the theological takes because for all of his flaws, and there's a lot of focus on his early period as a kind of weird esoteric quasi-Satanist, he is a theological thinker, even if not a very consistent one, even from an Orthodox Christian perspective. And I'm putting my biases out on the table there. But I wanted to get your take. How did you get interested in Alexander Dugin, and why does it matter to you?
I'm not going to go into a huge amount of detail about my Christian background, but I was raised Catholic, and I basically became evangelical, like a lot of young people do, through a born-again experience in college. And it was actually after I graduated from college, I started asking a lot of questions about life. Like I think when you're young, life is about pleasure and about just generally, feeling good about yourself and whatever. And then suddenly you hit reality, like life hits you hard and you realize life's hard. Some people might get married and have kids and they realize, am I going to have to suffer through this for 20 years, this sleeplessness and all this kind of stuff. I had some divorces in my family, and I just started asking questions about, can I actually get married and have a normal life and not have to have heartache and that type of thing. So I ended up kind of searching. I was interested in the Bible and theology when I was younger, actually. When I was in college, I read, I'm not as well versed in philosophy as you are. I did take a couple of philosophy classes. I read things like First Meditations on Philosophy by Descartes, and we started off with Plato's Last Days of Socrates, so like the basics. And I've read that little series called, Philosophers in 90 Minutes. I don't know if you've ever seen that. So I'm kind of like, I have a basic, generic understanding of who the philosophers are. I grew up watching Monty Python. I memorized the Philosopher's Song, so at least I know all their names, that kind of thing. So it's just, I'm very kind of a rube when it comes to philosophy, but I kind of come into it through reading people like Thoreau and literature, and then moving backwards. So I after I became a born again Christian, I started going over to Russia and Ukraine quite often. So it was like 1985, and by 1991 I was going to Russia and Ukraine. I got involved with a Christian newspaper, which is the website that we run today is called The Forerunner. That was the name of the newspaper. And we had this idea, what if we did a Russian version of The Forerunner? Someone told me that, you could actually raise money for this. And I was very skeptical about it. I said, I can see how it would cost me a lot of money. I don't see how I could make money off of it. But then lo and behold, I was able to do that. And we were actually able to do it a lot faster and a lot more efficiently than a lot of highly well-known ministries, because I just found the right people and I let them do everything. And I said, you understand this system. I have no idea what the Soviet system, how it works. I'm completely baffled by it. And they said, you don't understand this. You've only been here for a month. We've been here our whole life and we don't understand it, So I got to work with some very smart kids from Kyiv, Ukraine. One of the students was actually like one of the top math students in the entire country. He was a very brilliant kid. And another guy was very good with business. It was a good combination. A few other people. So we did that for about 10 years. And we also did video projects and things like that. So I used to go back and forth between Russia and America. I was not there for more than a month at a time, maybe 6 weeks at a month. But I spent several months out of my life there. When I came back to America, I would read the news and I would say, this is like a completely different picture in the mainstream media about what's going on in the former Soviet Union than what I've seen. Covered the 1996 election there. That's the one where the United States put a whole bunch of money behind Yeltsin.
Mm-hmm.
And he won the election. And I thought he was going to lose because I knew that, there was this other guy named Zhirinovsky, which was a nationalist. I was also somewhat of a fan of Alexander Solshenitsyn, although I haven't read all his books. I read one book he did called From Under the Rubble, which is about Christian dissidents in the Soviet Union, predicting the second Christianization of Russia. This is back like in the 70s, and they're writing about this. And so I did a few articles on that. I wrote some articles against the dispensationalist view of Russia, that they were going to be Gog and Gog in the end times and that type of thing. So I kind of come from things from what you would call like an optimistic millennial or a post-millennial viewpoint, where I do believe that there is such a thing as Christian progress in the world. There is such a thing as, you look at how America was founded and so on. There were certain principles of government, certain very important books like, if you look at things like what's the guy's name who wrote Wealth of Nations, and there's Lex Rex and books like that. So I always have been very interested in history, and I'm an English teacher, so I was interested in literature as well. So that's my perspective on Russia. Some of my best friends are from Russia and Ukraine, obviously too. I was in Ukraine and Russia about equal amount of time. I was in Ukraine 10 times and in Russia 10 times, total of 12 trips. And what I found was that it's when they talk about the Russian soul, that's a real thing. Like if you make a friend of a Russian or a Ukrainian, they're your friend. This is the kind of person you could call up in the middle of the night. I have a problem. They're going to drop everything. They're going to try to help you out. And it's not really easy to connect with people, but once you do connect with them, they take the relationship very seriously. So I just really kind of like fell in love with the culture there. When the Russia-Ukraine conflict happened, I'd already written a lot of articles about, Christianity and culture. Dr. Francis Schaeffer is another favorite author of mine. I'm somewhat into the Reconstructionist authors. I've cooperated with them. Don't agree with every single thing that they say, but I basically have that worldview, kind of like an optimistic worldview. We're going to move forward. The church is going to be around for a long time, and we have to do some good in the world. That's kind of my worldview. So when the Russia-Ukraine conflict happened, or about 2 years before that, a friend of mine from Ukraine came over, one of the guys that we worked with, and he was telling me about how I was saying, how is the country going? Is the reforms happening? And he said, no, things are worse than ever. And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, there's a war. A lot of people have left the country. The general health of the country is down. The economy is down. I said, really? Because what I've heard is that, things are kind of reforming. And he said, no, it's worse than ever. He actually mentioned his younger brother was sent to the front lines in Donbass. And so these are guys that are like, half Russian, half Ukrainian. So you can imagine, having your younger brother sent to the front line as a Russian, Ukrainian, fighting Russians. And so I was like, I didn't know that war was still going on. I thought that they had the Minsk agreements and it was solved. And I was not really paying attention to it that much anymore because I hadn't been for a few years. I think the last trip I took was 2007. Now this was like 2017. And he started telling me a lot of things that sounded like conspiracy theories. that like basically that there's a Ukraine project that the West has where they want to. So he's coming more from a Russian nationalist viewpoint, but he's in Ukraine, grown up in Kiev. So a lot of people in Kiev speak Russian, they're Russian. Things have changed a lot in the last 10 years, but there's always been like a strong Russian culture in Ukraine. And so we were doing a newspaper in Russian, out of Ukraine and going to all the different republics like Russia, Kazakhstan, different Belarus and places like that. So when the Ukraine war happened, he gave me a whole rundown on it. And I thought like, well, this isn't like anything like what I'm hearing. Then I ran across Tucker Carlson, Colonel Douglas McGregor, and another couple of YouTube bloggers I just started watching. At that point, I had turned off the mainstream media for watching news. I had another thing I should mention about myself is I'm actually a heart transplant patient. I had a heart transplant in 2020. I'm actually doing really well. I'm like one of the outstanding examples of recovery after heart transplant. But that was a very traumatic experience in my life. So in 2020, I turned off the news. I couldn't stand to watch the election. I couldn't stand to watch everything about January 6th. I couldn't stand to watch everything about COVID. So I just started watching a lot of video bloggers like yourself and other people. And that's where I started getting a lot of my information from. So I started getting like this alternative view on Ukraine. And one of the writers that came up was Samuel P. Huntington. He wrote a book called Clash of Civilizations. And then I was looking for people like Samuel P. Huntington. And I found this other author called Alexander Dugan on Scribed, which has become evergreen. I started reading it, didn't understand it at first. I read another author called Ray Dalio, which comes from an economic viewpoint. All three of these authors had this viewpoint that the world is changing, that we're going through not just a 100-year shift or a 500 or 50-year shift, but more like a 500-year shift. It's like things are moving away from the nation state idea of how nations should be from a liberal point of view and kind of back more toward a pre-modern civilizational state. So there's all these writers and authors that write about the rise of civilization states. Bruno Machis is another one. Although Bruno Machis hates Alexander Dugan, but they're both civilization statist guys. And the idea is that there is really this shift going on in the world. I've always been interested in that from a Christian perspective, just because there's an opportunity in that, because people are moving back toward, not so much conservatism, but more like traditional culture, traditional values, family, religion, that type of thing, as a basis for politics. I just found Dugan very compelling. I don't agree with everything he says. I don't understand everything he says, but I found a lot of it just really resonated with me. And even things I thought that I disagree with him on, I've kind of either come around on or I've developed an understanding of it, that he doesn't actually mean exactly that, but it's something slightly different. I think the first time I heard him, he was talking about how he felt Calvinism was evil. And the United States Protestant, not that we're evil, but he doesn't see that. But then he's kind of, in recent months, even in the last year or two, he's come around and said that if the United States is going to have a civilizational logos, it has to be Protestant Christianity. I just find it very interesting. And then recently, he did interviews with Tucker Carlson and a couple of other people that people might know. Judge Napolitano did an interview with him and so on. So he's really been coming up there. And like you said, there are people who really see him as dangerous, like Glenn Beck, for instance, and so on. So I listened to Glenn Beck talk about Dugan, and I said, well, he doesn't sound like he's read anything by Alexander Dugan. That's so I wanted to put something together to try to explain it to people, and I just ended up with this very massive book that I put out, and so that's what I'm here to talk about.
I think one of the interesting things that your departure signals to me, your departure from like a kind of, I would say, semi-apolitical conservative Christianity, semi is doing a lot of work there, admittedly, is that, the kind of tacit assumptions of Reagan fusionism really is over, Like, and I also, while I don't necessarily have the same optimistic look about the rise of civilizational states, I actually have also thought that the nation state has become an increasingly unviable project for a variety of reasons, which I would say, and I come from a left-wing point of view, as you know, but I would say I would even agree with one presumption of like someone like Patrick Deneen about this, that the contradictions of liberalism today made obvious in the nation state, both, exclusion and inclusion, constantly reinventing yourself while trying to maintain some kind of consistent political tradition, republicanism that is increasingly removed from any civic engagement, and I mean republicanism with a small r, and really is kind of a quasi-democratic way of administering just a quasi-democratic state. And one of the things that I find so fascinating right now is and I think Dugan's complaints about the West actually speak to this, is that I think all sides of American political life right now think they're losing somehow. And there really isn't a coherent civilizational message that you can derive out of liberalism other than enlightened self-interest. And when I was reading Dugan's For Political Theory, I reject a lot more of it than you do, having skimmed your book. But I was struck by how true that base presumption of his politics feels even to me, that the liberal tradition as we've understood it has nullified itself to the point that all that is really left is as atomized self-interest. And sometimes that's expressed in individual self-interest, and sometimes is expressed in community, aka usually identitarian and racial self-interest. But it is just those are the two forms really left to you. And nationalism, as it's been traditionally understood, will have an appeal because of the alienation that brings up, but also it's going to be too limited because what's your racial basis for state? What's your and the other thing that Dugan speaks to that I would agree with, we can talk about what I disagree with, but that American racialism has a Christianity-shaped hole in it, and some people will use that to blame Christianity. I think it's a lot more complicated than that. But as and I trace this on a very long history. I go back all the way to like the fall of Constantinople. But as Christendom's identity was subsumed in the end of the 15th century, Europeanness and then whiteness was brought up as a way to hold that civilization together. And I think Dugan's right. It doesn't really work. Yeah. Like, it's not something that's viable. Dugan has probably different reasons for me from thinking it's not viable, but I think he is correct that racialism is not going to be anything can hold a society together. So, and I think you even see this in the way that liberals both characterize, sometimes accurate, sometimes sometimes unfairly, the MAGA movement as, just alt-right, white nationalists. Because I was like, well, even a lot of them know that white nationalism is not a viable project in North America. Like, Sam Francis, from my perspective, an uber reactionary, but nonetheless, he admitted that. Yeah. In like the 90s. So it does seem that this has an interesting perspective. Now, I'm interested in your particular theological slant here. For those of my listeners who don't know Protestant Christian background at all, you do need to kind of know the difference between premillennialism, which is what most of us were exposed to in media in the 90s and early aughts, and postmillennialism, which has its own many forms of it, but I think was often used by liberals like Jeff Charlotte to scare people into thinking that there was a coming theocracy in America.
Right.
Um,
I'm familiar with Jeff Charlotte very well, so
yeah, I am.
There's
too.
an old saying about if you throw a rock into a pack of dogs, you know which one you hit by who yelps the loudest. And it's really interesting that like the post-millennial Reconstructionists, very small group, like very, very small group, but there are people that are terrified, and that's always interested me. You know, like what are they? What do they know? You know, it's kind of a funny thing. So you want me to give you my background? Could I ask your background first? Because I've heard you allude to it a couple of times. And if I'm not mistaken, I think that you said that you came out of somewhat of a fundamentalist background, or am I confused by that?
No, actually not at all. I come out of a Catholic background and a Jewish background. So I'm ethnically Jewish. My mom was a Jewish convert, and but she was raised Catholic. She reverted back to Catholicism. So I grew up in a Catholic, mostly Catholic family with some very strict Orthodox Jews in my family.
Well, must have been interesting.
Yeah.
My sisters, I have nephews that are Jewish, and so anyway, go on. Sorry.
Yeah. But I grew up in the deep South, and you can't, right. You know, if you're in Georgia and you don't understand Protestant Christianity, you don't understand your neighbors. So
I grew up in Framingham, Massachusetts, Italian Catholic, Irish Catholic neighborhood. I'm half Portuguese, half Irish, Swedish, you know. So, you know, the next door neighbors had 9 kids, 5 kids across the street, 6 kids, 5 kids. The Johnsons next door were Protestant. They had 2. We all went to Catholic CCD classes together. Grew up with that. And so I would say that my parents were not strict Catholics, but they weren't liberal either. They were kind of like in the middle. Mm-hmm. They didn't take the Bible literally. I did for some reason. I don't know why. I just felt like if this is the word of God, then I just kind of reasoned things through. And I became interested in Christian books when I was in high school, kind of had the typical, you know, 1970s rebellious years. And when I was older, like I said, I started asking questions and wound up in an Assemblies of God church first. I'd read a book called The Late Great Planet Earth by Hal Lindsey when I was 13 years old, and I became a mini prophecy expert. And then I actually heard the seminar 10 years later as an adult at age 23 and said, this makes absolutely no sense at all. This is crazy. And then I just went on a search to, you know, discover what theological basis there was. And I knew that there were other, let me give you a real quick rundown. If you look at the book of Revelation, the one thing that people always want to know is who's the Antichrist, who's 666. If you go to a Catholic Bible, like one I have, they'll give you a footnote and they'll say that some people say that this was Nero. Other people say it's a symbolic number, that it's, you know, 6 is imperfection, 7 is perfection. It's man who's imperfect, trying to become like the Trinity, you know, that type of thing. So I knew that there are other ways of interpreting. And so I just started reading a lot on it. And the view that I came to is like partial preterist postmillennialism. I think that when John wrote Revelation, he was writing about situations going on in the Roman Empire at that time, either under Nero, which is the early date view, or under Domitian, which is the late date view. I take the early date view. And that he was writing about this persecution that he witnessed, and also about the war on Jerusalem. And then there's applications of the book of Revelation that Christians can get comfort from, like people in persecution and whatever. But basically, it's not a book about the end times, per se. I mean, it does refer to that in the later chapters, but it's a book about contemporary politics in Rome, but in very figurative language because they were under persecution. And it's part of a whole genre called apocalyptics, which is all, you know, there's a whole, if you understand it, you can start to interpret the book. So so that's my theological background on that. As far as other things, I attended a church in Sanford, Florida. I'm in Kissimmee. R.C. Sproul is a fairly well-known theologian. He's a Calvinist, really into the Puritans and Jonathan Edwards and things like that. I went to school at UMass Amherst, right next to Northampton, where Jonathan Edwards was from. And I'm interested in the Puritans and that whole era. and realizing that they were very imperfect, but they also are a lot more influential than people realize that they were. And that there's a lot of things that we should reclaim, like especially their whole sense of community. You're a communist or a neo-Marxist, I guess. And if you go back and read a book like, John Winthrop's A Model of Christian Charity, he talks all about this communitarian, not a communist world, but a communitarian world where the rich, there are people who are rich and there are people that are poor, but they care for each other and that no one will lack, that type of a thing. So I think that that's missing from the political Christianity of today. There's a tendency of Christians to say, well, there's no political solutions, but then when they go to try to reform the society, it's, politics is the answer and the Republican Party is our vehicle. So I stopped voting Republican for president like in 1992. I got to know a guy named Howard Phillips, who is the founder of the Constitution Party, very similar to libertarians, but with a kind of a Calvinist Christian twist to it, although they include everybody. And I've always supported their candidates. And anytime there's a third candidate running that's better than the main two parties, I go with them. So that's where I am politically. And theologically, I would say that I haven't been all over the map, but I've kind of like I've been in different types of churches, and I tend more towards, Protestant Reformed, kind of like more like the tradition of the Reformation. I was involved with a Pentecostal charismatic church movement for a while, so I'm kind of open to that as well. And I'm Catholic in my heart, because I grew up Catholic. So my wife is Catholic, by the way. She's from Venezuela. And so I'm not ecumenical, like a liberal ecumenical, but I believe that, in the basics of Christianity, that there's a lot more similarity than there are differences. So we all agree on things a lot more than people realize that we do. So that's kind of like where I'm coming from.
Yeah. One of the things I think is very interesting about your book, other than Dugan himself, who's talked about Samuel Huntington, you actually zoom in on that connection. I have in my discussions too, but I think when I hear people talk about Dugan, I don't know. I mean, there's this like, he's Putin's Rasputin, whatever weird thing. And I'm like, one of the fascinating things about Dugan is while he's very informed in a almost 19th century Russian worldview, he is also very aware of American political science, including political realism. I mean, he seems very versed in Morgenthau and those people. And he's also pretty well versed in Huntington. And why do you think so many people miss the connection between Samuel Huntington and Dugan? Because I do not hear it commented on enough. And I think that does make Dugan make more sense.
They just don't. They're just not literate, basically, I think is what it is. I mean, I listened to you guys, and I was blown away because you're talking about Dugan and you're throwing around a lot of the jargon. I had to look all these words up, like you talk about atomization or dividuation rather than individuation. And I was having to, in Millerman's translation of it, I'm looking up the philosophers, like, who is this guy? I've never heard of him before. And so I'm listening to you guys talk about it. I'm going like, well, you actually are throwing around these words and taking this quite seriously. You have to understand that Huntington was a professor at Harvard in the 60s and 70s, all the way through the 90s. And there was a speaker at Harvard in 1978 called Alexander Solshenitsyn. And so Huntington would have heard this speech. And I've read this speech. It's called A World Split Apart. It was his, it was a commencement address he gave at Harvard. And he says there's a concept of the third world, thus we already have three worlds. He's talking about how the world needs to understand each other. And he's saying, the world constitutes a self-contained world full of riddles and surprises to Western thinking. As a minimum, we must include in this China, India, the Muslim world, Africa, if we indeed accept the approximation of viewing the latter two as uniform. For 1,000 years, Russia belonged to such a category. Then he mentions Japan, and the eighth civilization he mentions is Israel. So those are identical to Huntington's civilizations, with the exception of Israel. And Huntington sees Latin America as being separate from the Western world. And maybe a Russian like Solzhenitsyn wouldn't get that distinction. So I really believe that Huntington if he didn't get that from Solshenitsyn, he got it from other thinkers like Solshenitsyn. He may have been sparked by that, because 10 years later, he comes out with his own thesis on civilization states. Okay, so that's number one. And if you talk to, I've heard people talk to Dugan, and they think that he's this fascist, and he's, communist fascist. And he mentions his great admiration for Solshenitsyn and Huntington. Solshenitsyn, in fact, was much more of a nationalist than Dugan is. And that's another thing people don't get. Solshenitsyn was lionized by the West until people actually understood what he was talking about. And then they kind of like pushed him off to the corner because he was so conservative. I was in a flat in Moscow in 1995, I think it was. And this program came on TV, and it was Solshenitsyn. He had like a daily talk show. And he was talking to people about rebuilding Russia and everything like that. And I talked to the family I was staying with, and I said, do you know who this guy is? Because I was like, a big admirer of Solshenitsyn. And they were like, yeah, he's an old man that likes to tell us how we should be. Because Solshenitsyn really was not that popular in Russia because he was banned. So people didn't know about him. And people who are educated did, but not everybody. He wasn't like this figure like he is here. So I think that's part of it. People don't get what the Russian culture is all about. They don't understand that, Dugan was actually arrested. He didn't spend jail time like Solshenitsyn, but he was arrested for having anti-communist books. Mm-hmm. And his parents, I guess, were, got implicated with that. His parents were fairly important in academia, so that was like a big deal. And then he went through a period of time in which he did try to blend fascism with communism, but it wasn't like the Third Reich fascism. He was saying, well, the fascists have this good point where they believe in patriotism and they believe in deep culture, like going back to the German, the roots of the German culture. That's very good. And that communism, even though he felt that economically it was a failure, he felt that communism had a great deal of worth because it was against racism. And it was also for the oppressed, that we should help the oppressed people in the world. So I listened to that as a Christian. I go, well, that's how I should be. I should be, in favor of the oppressed, against racism. I should have a love for my culture, my family, and so on. So that was how I was attracted to him. But I post a lot of things online about Dugan. And one of the common things I often get is, yeah, you should read him to understand him, but you have to understand this man's very dangerous. Well, why is he dangerous? Well, because he's a Satanist, he's an occultist, he's a fascist. And I try to show how that's not true. But when people accept a certain narrative, it's very hard to talk them out of it.
I mean, the interesting thing about Dugan's thinking is I don't think many people have dealt with the split between his early National Bolshevik stuff, where he was messing around with occultism, like explicitly, and this conversion experience that he has, partly because I don't think we think of Eastern Orthodox Christians as having conversion experiences. So
I saw it. I was there when that was going on. I'm the same age as Dugan is, by the way. We're both 63 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And I've got some touch up on the video. But I listened to him, and it sounds like he was converted in the late 1980s. But then he kind of like had, he went through this dark night of the soul type of thing that the Orthodox and Catholics are into. And he didn't really one of the geopolitics book that he wrote. It's called what's it called? Geopolitics, and it's the earliest book that he wrote.
Oh, what's that called in English? Yeah. Let me look that up fast.
Anyway, he wrote a book that's not available through his publisher.
Foundations of Geopolitics.
Foundations of Geopolitics, and basically, from what I understand, it's very pro-Russian nationalist. Mm-hmm. And it's very hard to get. You can find it as a PDF file, but the group Arctos that publishes his book now doesn't carry that book. So he's kind of renounced that. So Dugan, as of 1996, I think, when he wrote Foundations in Geopolitics, is different from the Dugan of 2009. which is when he wrote Fourth Political Theory. And as you know, as a philosopher, it's not unusual for philosophers to completely flip on some things, you know. So he flipped, and he's renounced nationalism. I don't think he was ever a racist, but he thinks that project, the National Bolshevik Project, I know that from being involved with the Constitution Party. You start a splinter party, and it attracts a lot of weird people.
Yeah.
You know, and so he was really fed up with the people that it was attracting, and they were actually saying the opposite things that they started off with. So he broke with the National Bolshevist Party, and he started to really look more deeper into the whole idea of civilizational logos, and still very mystical, but not like he was before, like more of a lighter kind of a mysticism rather than a dark mysticism.
Right. Well, I mean, when you read Dugan now, if you read him closely and you take him at face value, which I admit very few people, even some of his fans in the West, don't. It is interesting to compare him with the other major figure out of the National Bolshevik Party that is known in the West, and that is Edward Lemanoff. And Lemanoff is, you know, all kinds of interesting in that he was in literary exile in the West for a long time, and he was promoted racism, but he also promoted a bunch of people that we associate with liberals today. You know, I think, you know, he was a funder of The Exiled, which is where like Matt Taibbi and Mark Ames and John Dolan and those kind of people come from. Taibbi being by far the most famous. And it's been interesting, you know. Lemanoff died in 2000, just before COVID. I mean, he didn't die of COVID; it was a die of complication of surgery. But and that has been interesting compared to the reemergence of Dugan. Now, one thing I wanted to ask you, since you go back and forth, I've talked to people who lived in Russia, and I have some people who tell me adamantly that Dugan's not important.
Yeah.
I have some people who've even told me he is important, but not for Russians. He's important for outreach to other parts of the world, so to the Islamic world and the American world. And I have some people like, oh, actually, he does have an influence on United Russia, although maybe a minor one. I don't know. You've gone back and forth. What is your experience with Russians and Ukrainians responding to Dugan?
I have a lot of Russian friends and Ukrainian friends. They've all heard of him. If you were to ask the average American on the street, who's Alexander Dugan, they have no idea. 99% of the people don't. You and I do. People that run in our circles do. People listen to Glenn Beck do, because they've been warned about him. As a matter of fact, I look at Dugan's YouTube channel since he was unbanned, and you know, he gets 100 views on his videos. You know, so it's not like he's even well known in the West. Everyone in Russia that I've talked to has heard about him. Now, let me explain too. When I was in Russia, I met a lot of very smart young people, and I kind of asked the question: is everybody this smart? Like, why is it that every church I go into, people are so smart and so talented? They're artists, and they're computer science majors, and they're musicians, and they, you know, just like this incredible talent. And it was explained to me that the Christian revival that happened in Russia in the late 1980s and early 1990s really hit the intelligentsia. It was actually a class of people in Russia who were, you know, children of university professors and things like that. And because they were thinkers, they were considered to be dissidents, so they formed their own class. And Christianity was particularly attractive to them on a philosophical level. But then when perestroika and glasnost hit, there was, and I, you know, like as a Christian, I believe that this is the Holy Spirit movement. I believe that this is something that God did. And, you know, he raised up these leaders. There are these leaders in Russia that there's one group, I actually know them. They had the #1 song in Belarus. It's like this pop song, and they're a Christian group. And they didn't, it's not like in America where we have Christian contemporary music, but they're actually a Christian group that had a #1 song on the charts just because they're incredibly talented people. So I just saw a lot of that. So that's the world that Dugan comes out of. He's part of the intelligentsia. And I think that among the intelligentsia, you're going to have a lot of people that hate Dugan in Russia. There are a lot of people that are ambivalent about him, and a lot of people that that like him. And he, there's also different versions of Dugan. There's Dugan the blogger. There's Dugan the university professor. There's Dugan the political scientist. He has different persona that he inhabits from time to time. I'll read something by him and I'll go, that's kind of cringy. Like he'll do like a tweet or something and I'll go, this is not what I would want to present to people. But then if you read his book, it's actually very, very deep. So I wanted to mention that about the intelligentsia up front, because I think that that's important to understand. One of my best friends, I mentioned him to her, and she said that, yeah, I understand he's very brilliant, and he's written a lot of good things on politics and philosophy, and that's all she knew about him. I think that the reason why Dugan is considered important in Russia is not because he's influential, but because he's in tune with the zeitgeist.
Yeah, I've actually wondered that too, because some people will in the West, when we hear certain phrases that are translated from Russian into English, we're like, "Oh, that's Dugan," and I've always been like, maybe that's more Dugan picking up common talking points in Russia that we just don't get.
The scary thing is when you listen to Putin or even now Xi and people in Latin America, and they're talking about multipolarism, and they could have gotten that from Huntington, they could have gotten it from Mashas, they could have gotten it from a lot of different people. But I hear it and I go, whoa, even like I heard Marco Rubio talking about, the unipolar world is dead now. We can't expect that to go on forever. The world for most of history has been multipolar. I've never heard a U.S. senator say that. So I'm wondering, it's filtering in. It's not just Dugan. It's part of this civilizational shift that we're seeing. And so he picked up on it earlier than most people did. And he read Huntington and he synthesized a lot of philosophy, Heidegger especially. And he was able to get some traction on it, I think is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, the civilizational state stuff is quite interesting to me, because I think if you read the political realists right now of both the conservative and the liberal variety, so whether or not you're reading Peter Zion, and that's Zeihan, even though just so people who want to look it up, are Mersheimer, John Mersheimer, for the more traditionally kind of robust but conservative realist, they both agree that the expansionist phase of American empire is over. And unlike in the 90s and aughts, there's no denying that we were an empire. Right? Yeah. One of the great weirdnesses of like my background is I am a far leftist now, but I do come from a kind of brief flirtation with paleoconservatism because of particularly this one thing, and that was they were also talking about like the kind of peak imperialism in denial after the Cold War, and so many of them, I think about Pat Buchanan, couldn't justify it anymore after the Cold War was over. It's like, why are we still doing this? We, the great enemy of Russian communism, and specifically, is gone now. Why is this maintained? And yet you're expanding this. And that was an interesting time for someone like Huntington. I bring this up because Huntington's a figure, kind of like earlier right-wing figures like James Burnham, who was important to both the paleoconservative and neoconservative movements. For the neoconservative movement, he was a rationalization for the war on terror. But, and the West versus, Islamofascism or whatever. But for the paleoconservative movement, he was a kind of problematic but rationalization of the return to something like a Christendom, which they very much liked. Although one of the things I'll say about my experience in paleoconservatism is there weren't that many Protestants in it. It was a very Catholic affair with a few, I would say, Rushdooniite, and you would know who that is. I'm not sure my audience would know who that is, but Rushdooniite holdouts like Gary North. But in general, that was not a political theology or a political movement that had a very large sway with Protestants until relatively recently. If you think Trump is kind of a synthesis of Reagan fusionism and paleoconservatism, which I do, but I know that's kind of a controversial position even on the right.
The way that I see it is that the shift is not so much, like I would say everything you've described, according to Dugan, this is something new for me, is that it's all liberal. Liberal with a capital L, meaning like a libertarian is a liberal, but they're on the right. A classical liberal like a Thomas Jefferson is a liberal. A federalist like Hamilton is a liberal because they believe in individual rights. Right, that's the most important thing. That's the political subject of liberalism, is individualism and individual rights. And what I realized was that for many years I was trying to synthesize that with Christianity. And one of the things that Dugan made me realize is that they're antithetical. Actually, if you look at the teachings of the Bible does not teach you to be an individual. It teaches you to be part of a community and to deny yourself and to love others as much as you love yourself, that type of thing. So individualism, I think, in the form of liberalism is something that's infected Christianity. And I think that a lot of people are starting to wake up to that. So what you see now is not so much like the spectrum from the right versus the left on a horizontal plane, but you see something vertical, where it's more like populism versus elitism. And that's the reason why Trump has people in his cabinet like RFK Jr. and Tulsi Gabbard and Elon Musk, who are leftists, but they're classical leftists. You see, they're not these, they're not these neoliberal or postmodernist leftists, but they're not woke leftists, in other words. And so that's the shift that's happening. Like, I think that like you and I could probably agree on a lot of things. Someone who's a Christian Reconstructionist and a Marxist, we could actually go like, this is bad over here. Here are some things that we can agree on are not good. And we're going to disagree on a lot of things, but there's going to be other things that we're going to agree on too. That's the shift that's happening. And I always thought that right versus left divide was kind of artificial anyway. I thought that, people used to say it's a uniparty. There's not a dime's worth of difference between Republicans and Democrats. Republicans want abortion after 15 weeks and Democrats want it all the way to birth. Republicans want a deficit of, $2 trillion a year, and Democrats will push it to $3 trillion, or maybe sometimes reverse. Maybe the Republicans want more of a deficit than the Democrats. When you look at actually what they do in reality, you realize that they're not doing what they say on paper. And so that's the populist movement. People are waking up to it, that it's all a big lie. That basically most of what we read in the media is a lie. I was talking to a guy in Melbourne, Florida. He spent his whole life in the military, in the Navy. And he came to this Christian event that was covered by a newspaper, and he read about it in the newspaper. And he said, this doesn't sound anything like the event I went to. They're slamming it. They're saying all these negative things. It wasn't the event I went to. It's just a very leftist slant toward it. And so he said, not long after that, he talked to an admiral, and he said that, how much of what we read in the media about foreign affairs and warfare is true? Is half of it true? And the guy said, no. He says, well, how much is? He goes, less than that. It's like 60%, 70%, probably 95% of it is made up stuff, And I really think that is correct. People follow a narrative, and even the facts that they use are force fit to the narrative in what we see in media. So a lot of people are waking up to that. People aren't turning on Fox News anymore, although our politicians do, unfortunately. Trump watches Fox News all day. If you can't tell that, half his cabinet are Fox News contributors or anchor people from Fox. It seems like, I haven't counted them, but there's a lot of them in there. So it's like there's a disconnect from reality to what's presented to us. So that's the populist movement. And that's where, again, I think that, Dugan is going to continue to be interesting to people. He's starting to he wrote some more recent books. He has one called the Trump Revolution recently that he wrote. There was The Great Awakening versus the Great Reset, which is targeted toward an American audience. And it's very like light reading. There's another one that just came out. It's called trying to remember the name of it, but it's very good. It just came out recently, but it has to do with, American populism and things like that. And I think that he misses like what a lot of American populism is about because he hasn't been here.
Mm-hmm.
But what a lot of the stuff that he does say is going to resonate with people. So,
yeah. Ironically, when I was reading Fourth Political Theory, the book, I found that a lot of his portrayals of the American public were actually based on liberal media consensus. Because I was like, yeah, that's what liberals say. That's not really. I mean, even at me, the dirty rotten Marxist knows that's not really how Americans actually are. These are what, educated people who are relatively isolated from the vast majority of the population and live in high urban, inexpensive urban areas, even when they're downwardly mobile, don't really know what it's like to be in Alabama or Florida or here in Utah. And I think, one of the things I'll say about the last election is I was unpopular with a lot of my liberal friends for saying, for example, that, the economy's during the Biden administration is doing okay if you're a billionaire, and it'll do okay under Trump if you're a billionaire too. But the reason why people are mad isn't just ideological. You are just so removed from people having to buy, groceries that have gone up over the course of 5 years, 20-30%, even though you're talking about it in brief chunks where where you're statistically describing it as a 3 to 9% increase, and aren't going down while their pay went up 10%, particularly if they were younger and actually in the lower end of the fields. That the middle actually didn't get that much gain. So of course people are angry, and it's weird to pretend that it's all about just like individual racism or even systemic racism, and most liberals can't tell the difference. That's why this is happening, and a lot of my, I have conservative friends. This is one thing I try to tell people on the far left is if you only know far leftist, you really can't talk to other people. And that's also true for like evangelicals. Is all you know is evangelicals.
Yeah.
You can't do an outsider test. You have no idea how you sound to people who don't share your worldview. And I make a big deal out of that because, I mean, I've been accused of being elitist in a lot of stuff because I use a lot of big words, and that's fine. But
so you're just, I'm sorry for interrupting. Your profession right now is what? You're a teacher, or?
I'm a high school teacher. I'm not a college professor.
I'm a high school teacher too, so it's like, I picked that up. I thought you taught at some community college or something like that.
I do. I actually do teach at a community college as well, but it's like a side gig. It's a concurrent enrollment gig. It's not my main job.
Yeah, so I was going to say, like, I'm a teacher and my wife's a waitress, and we're both in our 60s. My wife came here, 20 years ago from Venezuela. And so, we're not, for college educated people, we're not high earners, but for Florida, we are, because we've been doing this for a while. So we have a house and we have some savings and but I understand exactly what you're talking about. I mean, I taught in a Title X school, gangs and things like that. The school I teach in now is more of a conservative area because I prefer not to teach in, I prefer not to teach in that kind of a school anymore. But I know exactly what you're talking about. We're the richest country in the world, but we have people living in poverty. I mean, you can go to a ghetto in Moscow and it's like a lot of other areas of the city, and people go, yeah, this is the ghetto. And I go, it doesn't look that much different to me. I'll take you to a ghetto in my town in Orlando. You can see a ghetto if you want,
I have to remind people of that, and I also have to remind them that actually a lot of leftists are very far removed from that. Yes. So like when I'm like, even if you go to like, say you go to Atlanta, I'm like, no, go to Macon, go to Warner Robins, go down even to the bad side of Savannah that's not the tourist district. Go down to somewhere closer to you, Jacksonville, Florida. I mean, you'll still see people living in buildings made out of cinder blocks. And we're the richest country in the world. And when you're in New York, that does not exist. There's poverty in New York. There's poverty in California. I'm not here to belittle that. In fact, now California really is only the super rich and the impoverished because they can't leave. But in general, I I find that worldview is, on one hand, like people were talking about. I give you an example of this, and this is where I'm sympathetic to someone like to a lot of right wingers complaining about left wingers. We talk about like educational equity, but what do they focus on? Universal college education, which I'm like, well, universal college education is okay, but I can tell you I've lived in countries that had it. It still favors the rich, honestly, because they can get into the universities, and unless you have infinite money, you can't provision infinite universities for everybody. So, and why would you want to either? Why aren't you focusing on better high school education with more practical outcomes? Like, why aren't we teaching people multiple skill sets and including things like how to fix their car? Like things that were harder and harder to do. And admittedly, we live in a more specialized world. But I think people realize that there's like a fundamental contradiction in liberalism. One of the things that, again, I don't want to sound like people who listen to my show know I disagree with Dugan on a ton. But I agree with him that most of the modern world, particularly the American world, is liberal. So when I talk about right and left, I'm really just talking about the right and left of liberalism, not even of capitalism, like of liberalism post the 14th century. There are some political developments in Europe that are not that. De Maistre, but even, I mean, people will you read someone like Julius Evola, weird guy. I don't want to sound like it. I like him, but like, he's critiquing fascism for being too liberal, for being too for being too mechanistic and too into racial, like biological race and all this stuff. And a lot of leftists make fun of that. They're like, oh, he doesn't mean it. And I'm like, no, I think he does. I think he's very sincere.
Do you think it was the socialist aspect of fascism that he didn't like, or was it?
It was the socialism, but I think even more it was the racialism, particularly the biological racialism. He had like this idea of spiritual race, but he kind of believed that, like, like for example, I would say, from a Jewish perspective, that Evola was anti-Jewish. In that he did not like the Jewish religion. But if you converted to his weird syncretic perennialism, he would probably accept you. He had there's nothing about your biology that was really of concern to him. Which
I think too that a lot of people don't understand that a large part of anti-Semitism in Nazi Germany was political. That they felt that they were enemies of the state. Like Heidegger, as you probably know, had Jewish mistresses. And they were protected because they like, well, they're safe because he wasn't a very good Nazi, but so he had Jewish mistresses, and so they were protected by him because they figured, well, he's there with him, so how bad can they be? So there were Jewish fascists too. I'm not defending fascism by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm saying that people have this idea that it was all about race. And it was a little bit more complicated than that. There was a mystical element in fascism too, where like people like Ebola and Himmler probably would have liked it to go in that direction more. Where let's really talk about what the Aryan spirit is and that type of thing. And so
absolutely. Now I do think from a Christian worldview that would be a problem. But Ebola was not a Christian by any stretch of the imagination. I want to be clear on that to people. But like, I do think, I think also that Dugan is right, that Marxism emerges out of liberalism, actually, as he says, fascism does too, as a response to it, which is my own thing. So
say that one more time, because I think that's important. Say that one more time.
Marxism emerges out of liberalism as a response to liberalism.
Right.
So
that's what Dugan says. Yeah.
Right.
I know a lot of the the right wing anti-modernist philosophers say that too.
Right. And I find it maddening when I listen to people like James Lindsay like blame stuff that I think capitalist modernity does on me, and I'm just like, one, we're not that powerful, guy, and two, you're really mad about liberalism, but you can't admit that because you're also a liberal, and if you have to deal with that, that's going to lead to a crisis. So blame every problem that has emerged out of liberalism on cultural Marxism or whatever.
Yeah.
Paul Gottfried is good on this point.
A question about this. I wanted to kind of explore this fascist angle a little bit more, but what do you think about Dugan's critique of the modernist theories in general? Like, he would say that there's really no such thing as a Marxist today. They're neo-Marxists, and that the whole idea of, class warfare and that dialectic has been gutted from Marxism. So what we have now is more of like what they call a simulacra. It's a simulation of Marxism, like what you said in Gramsci's cultural Marxism and social justice and the whole woke type of a thing. So I hear my friends talking about, these people are communists. And I'm saying, no, they're not communists. They're just liberals. And you say they're communists because you don't know what else to call them. It's like they're actually more like you than you think that they are. So what do you think about that critique? Do you think that there are still Marxists today?
Honestly, my critique would be slightly different than Dugan, and that Dugan would make it about ideology because he thinks ideology is a major driver. And I would say there is no real Marxist movement in so much as there is no workers' movement of which Marxists are cleanly in dialogue with. Marxists were never in charge. I mean, like, as much as I would love to tell you historically that Marxists were, emerged from the workers' movement, that's not really true. They were part of it, but they emerged separately. But today there's no such movement for them to merge with. They keep on trying to create one. They being like Jacobin Magazine and whatever, but a lot of times they're being self-dishonest about it. For example, all the talk of union renewal has just ignored the bald-faced stats on while unions are very much more popular and even conservatives like them a lot more than they used to, no one is in them. Like, not no one, but like, I think something like 11 to 15% of the population is in them. Like, it's very low. And so when you talk about that, it's just false to pretend that like we're in this moment of this big socialist heyday. I would also say, for example, similar to you, I think a lot of Marxists today who were like, I like socialism, but when you ask them what socialism is, it's basically progressivism from the 1930s. They think it's the same thing that FDR did. And it's weird to me because, like, I'm like, so you believe what the reactionaries, actually don't think it's fair. I should just say traditional fusionist Reagan conservatives say that social goods and socialism are the same thing. You've just flipped it and decided that that's good because we do need social goods. Everyone, I think, even most conservatives now are admitting that. They don't want to necessarily give it. They don't
see it. They don't see it in front of their face is what it is. Where we are we're in a liberal socialist world, and they don't realize that this is the air that we breathe. It's kind of like being on the Dune planet. You don't realize that you're breathing the spice until your eyes turn blue, and I see that's one of the things that Dugan has done for me is he's enabled me to see it, and I see that I am a liberal modernist because that's what I grew up with. And I go, it's incompatible with my faith, and I need to really examine it and critique it a lot more than I do. That's the reason why I asked you about Marxism, is that, Dugan goes on from there and he says that, fascism was a critique of liberalism and communism from the right. Do you think that's accurate? You agree with that?
I do agree with that. In fact, I've gone to the point, because a lot of leftists will say, oh, well, fascism is liberalism in crisis. And I have gone on to say it's also socialism in crisis, which, pisses pretty much everybody off.
Everybody's socialist. Yeah, you can be a socialist and be a liberal, a communist, or a fascist. Yeah, socialism is a economic system. It's not an ideology necessarily.
Right, and I would agree with that. In fact, I sometimes mock gently because I'm not generally a hater of people's religions. My Mormon friends who talk about the good rugged individualism, I'm like, your symbol is literally a beehive. And you believed in common property until Brigham Young reforms in the 1890s. want to point that out to you from your own history. This is not me picking up anti-Mormon stuff. This is just
Right.
What you guys believed. And, it tells you how one of the critiques I would have, like I have a very close friend who I talk to all the time who's Russian Orthodox. He's American and grew up in an evangelical background, kind of like almost the mirror inverse view in some ways. But, we would talk about this and one of the things that I would say to him a lot, and he would end up agreeing with me, is just like the world that we live in is so pervaded by liberalism and then the responses to it, that when people see things that are older than that, or more communitarian than that, which is most of human history, frankly, they don't really know how to respond to it other than calling it communist or fascist, because those are the two things that emerge from liberalism, particularly after liberalism develops into full-blown capitalism, and that's its mode of production, blah, blah, blah. I have my Marxist way of explaining it. I know that Dugan would explain it in terms of like ideological essences and stuff. One of the things I realized reading Dugan's Fourth Political Theory that I didn't realize the first time I read him is how much I needed to understand Aristotle. Even though, he's an Eastern Orthodox thinker, he's kind of skeptical of what he would call Western Christian rationalism and their love of Aristotle, going back to the Thomists. He probably disagree with the Lester McIntyre, but you do really need to understand Aristotelian political categories and stuff, as well as all this postmodernism that he deals with, to get what he's talking about. And I've really had to. I mean, it's been a challenge to me to go back and make sure I understand the Greek categories in Aristotle in a better way than just the kind of watered down liberal form I got of that, from going to college. Because I will tell you, you said there's no Marxism today. I've actually said, I've even gone further than this. Like, I meet Platonists, and I'm like, you're not a Platonist. You can't exist in that episteme. It's not yours. Like, you can pull from Platonism, you can learn from Platonism, you can be a Neoplatonist, although that also is different from what that term has historically meant. But you can't put yourself in the mind of Plato. Similarly with Aristotelians, this is actually one of my minor critiques of Lester McIntyre, the kind of Catholic Christian ethic theorist, is like, you can't make yourself a Thomist again. Yeah. That world is not really our world. Even if it reemerges, Neo-Thomism will have to emerge in response to the liberal world in which you grow into. I'm not even sure McIntyre would have disagreed with that, but it makes someone like McIntyre, who started off as a Marxist, who actually really incomprehensible to America.
I'm going to help out some of your viewers here who are like me. You mentioned McIntyre. Explain who McIntyre is.
All right.
One thing that I want when I watch your program, you guys throw around.
Yeah.
You guys have master's degree in philosophy, and if you want to reach people that don't, you should explain who some of these people are, because I've heard of the name. That's it. So,
yeah. Lester McIntyre is a former Marxist who converted to Catholicism, I believe, in the late 60s or early 70s. He's from Britain, although he lived most of the last half of his life in the United States. He died at almost 100 years old, I believe a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago. There's been a lot going on this summer, so maybe I've dropped some time. But he was part of the movement of the return to virtue ethics, and he considered himself, he was called a communitarian, and he didn't really like that. He thought it was too vague. But he was a virtue ethicist and a neo-Thomist who also thought that, like, we had to reckon with the fact that things like human rights, let's just get on human rights. He would point out that human rights is justified in a mixture of Catholic natural law and then its Protestantization / liberalization in John Locke. But that today, no one believes in that. There's no liberal who really believes in even John Locke's form of natural law. So how are you justifying all the rights talk?
Right.
Like you can't justify it theologically, you can't justify it materialistically. It doesn't logically flow from either Kantian deontology, for I've used big words, but Kant's ethical system, or utilitarianism, which is what most liberals today really are selectively, which is the greatest good for you do the greatest good for the greatest number. Who counts as part of the greatest number? And some people, if you like read Peterson, that includes everything, including flies. Right. So how do you make any decision about that? McIntyre says you can't. There's no way. The best you can do is pick up the virtues of your culture, see them modeled, and work that out. Once you do that, you can actually act fairly objectively, but there's no singular rule from which you can possibly deduce an ethical norm. And I agree with him on that. Yeah. What I find interesting is his project was basically to try to bring back Thomistic philosophy. And I'm going to explain, now I got to explain this to my non-leftist thing. So that is that is Aquinas' ethical philosophy of the early modern period that kind of mixes Islamic natural law, traditional Catholic theology, and Aristotle together, and is the basis of Christian rationalism going back to the end of the medieval period. So my critique of McIntyre was that you can't really bring Thomism back. You can't really bring the world of Thomas Aquinas back to us. We don't live in that world, and there's not really a way to get back to that. And I think what's interesting about this when I deal with someone like Dugan is I don't know how much, and I say this, I've probably not read as much Dugan as you. I've read about 5 books, including a book.
I've read just a few books by him. I mean, I have a bunch I've ordered that I haven't cracked yet. I've looked through them, but fourth political theory is short one, which is called Great Awakening versus Great Reset. And I've looked a little bit at his this whole thing about, there's 2 different books on what are they called? Right up here. Anyway, ethnosociology, which I think that's the whole basis of. And then he has a very long series I'd like to read that's not in English yet. That's his Pneumachia series, which I find fascinating. But so I mainly know a lot about Dugan through Michael Millerman, who is his translator. I watch a lot of his stuff. So,
all right. So I can tell you what I've read by Dugan real fast while I look this up. Let's see. I've read Putin versus Putin, the Fourth Political Theory and the Rise of Fourth Political Theory, and the Eurasian Mission. And I read them oppositionally. I'll also admit that I did not come out to I was not interested in resuscitating Dugan, although I do think, I've gone back and forth about whether or not I have another conservative friend who tells me I wait, not because he thinks Dugan is dangerous. He says that, I'm wasting too much time on this. This is not what most American conservatives think. And I'm like, well, but it is speaking to a certain group of people, and I want to understand why.
Okay. I'll tell you one thing. There's certain things that scare people about Dugan. Okay? Like we mentioned earlier, I had one Facebook friend that I was going back and forth with, and he was saying, you really shouldn't be pushing Dugan on people. He's dangerous. I said, why? And so he mentioned the geopolitics book. Mm-hmm. And he gave me all these quotes from geopolitics. And I said to him, that he doesn't actually follow that anymore. So that's number one. The other thing that I found scary about Dugan is he's always, it seems like he's anti-individual rights. Mm-hmm. And what I realize is that it's not so much that he's against individual rights. He thinks that individual rights don't actually exist. Where individual rights are a construct from the Enlightenment, where people decided that people were born as a tabula rasa. We were born like a noble savage, and then we join into a community and we do contract, social theory, and all that type of stuff. And then the state exists in order to protect our natural rights. That's not what Christianity teaches. I mean, it might be some of Thomas Aquinas in there, but what I believe that biblical law teaches is that we're human beings made in the image of God, and therefore human beings have dignity and value. So that therefore you can't kill a person. You get your right to life from that. You can't steal a person's property because God gave it to you. That's you shall not steal. You can't violate the sanctity of marriage because it symbolizes God's relationship with the church and so on. And so our rights are all based on community. Rights don't make any sense unless you come into a community. How can someone violate your rights unless you're in a relationship with people? So individual rights aren't something that you possess. What they are is liberties. So Dugan goes through this long thing where he critiques liberalism and tells us how bad it is. And at the very end of it, is there anything good that we can get from liberalism? Yes, there's one very important thing: freedom. And then you go like, okay, but he's talking about a different kind of freedom than what people think about when they talk about my rights. He's not talking about the type of rights that are continually, broken down. We need to have rights for, trans rights and gay rights and animal rights and all the way down the line. And so he says that you have that type of a world, and other anti-modernist philosophers have said this too. The state ends up becoming your God that has to protect your rights. It creates your rights, it gives you your rights, therefore it can take them away. So you have to serve the state. And then you create what Sartre called a prison without walls. So I found that very compelling. That's the part of Dugan that I like. And that's if you read Alexander Solshenitsyn's From Under the Rubble. He has Christian dissidents writing on that, about how the idea of rights divorced from Christianity becomes this parody.
Right.
And something that's very oppressive towards, the very people that champion it. So that's one of the things that really appealed to me when I was reading it. So.
Well, I would actually agree with that. One of the funniest things is I have some leftists who've called me a reactionary specifically on this point, because I've been like, well, we don't really believe in the justification of human rights as was understood, like by the framers of the Declaration of Independence. We don't. We just don't believe in that. We don't have a consensus on that. And I want to know how else you're justifying this. And the other thing that I talk about this part of Marx and Engels a little bit that people miss, and both conservatives and modern Marxists, is they actually say in multiple places, rights also entail responsibilities, because you have rights as part of a political community, thus you also have responsibilities as part of that political community. They might be unalienable, but it also means you can't get out of the responsibilities either. And
so you're not completely free. You're bound to something.
Right. You're bound to something. You're bound to you're bound to, I mean, they would say your class community and all that. And, the goal is to, the goal in Marxism, at least classically, and again, this is why I'm somewhat sympathetic, because I don't think this is the goal of modern Marxists, but is to undo class. It isn't just to get revenge on the rich or anything like that. It's so that there is no class. And a lot of Christians would be like, well, that's utopian. And I'd be like, well, okay, fine. But that was the goal. Whereas today it's often like, well, there should be no billionaires. And I'm just like, but it is weird. I mean, I live in a world where on certain things, cultural things, for example, I can listen to Tucker Carlson and get sick to my stomach. And then there's other things he'll talk about like stuff like people being able to have houses. And even when he says like, we don't necessarily need to punish the rich, and I might slightly disagree with him, but he'll say stuff like, the fact that there's so much accumulation is obscene, and I mean, how can I reject that? Like, even from my perspective, I have to admit that, like, well, I might not share your class collaboration as means of how you'd achieve that, but it's not that different from the world I want, and that also entails us having to be in community with each other,
right?
And so that's one of the things that has gotten me in knots about how to respond to contemporary left-wing politics. Because on one hand, I do think we have to admit that, like, when we're talking to conservatives, I don't necessarily share worldview, and I shouldn't pretend to. I think it is when people are like, oh, we should like find out what the conservative wants and just appease them to do that. And I'm like, well, why would they trust you? Because that feels like a dishonest move. But I do think we have to know where these different groups of people are coming from and where you can and cannot make compromises with people about. And I think one of the things about the liberal worldview today in its current instantiation is that that's impossible for them because, one, they don't view, because you're so atomized, there's no distinction between personal and political ethics. And thus, there's also no distinction between personal and political motivations. So people say, oh, my politics is my ethics, is my morality. And I'm like, that doesn't make sense to me. Like, those things can't really be the same thing because your morality is about you, your ethics is about your relations to other people, and your politics emerges from the way you, in my mind, have to deal with force in a society and manage that. Those are different things. And you have collapsed them into one thing that is also very you-centric. It's very about your individual rights, beliefs, and manifestations, and ignores that all those exist in a social context. Even though you talk about systems all the time, you don't look at who those systems are made up of and what they are. They aren't just abstractions that you fall into. And, I think a lot of people have a very difficult time dealing with that.
Right. Well, I mean, I mentioned earlier about how I grew up in this neighborhood where there were 9 kids next door and 5 kids across this little cul-de-sac. And, what we did as kids was we played kickball and games until it got dark in the summertime. And so everybody knew each other. I can still name all the names of all the kids I grew up with in my neighborhood. Whereas today, I don't know who my next door neighbor is. I mean, I know their names. I see them once in a while and so on. So people don't realize how much things have actually changed in the last 50 years or so in this country. So if you're like of a certain age, you basically were born into that, what you call the atomized world where everything is so individualistic that your friends are not people next door, they're people online, for instance. And so that's like one of the things when you read Dugan, like one of the things I really liked about him is he talked about he has these really odd ideas, but you think that he's completely crazy, and then you realize that there's a lot of wisdom in it. Like when he talks about the metaphysics of the washing machine. Do you know that one? In Russia, when I was in Russia, there were a lot of people living in 1-room flats, 2-room flats. If you were very well off and your parents were a member of the Communist Party, you might have a 3-room flat, and a lot of people didn't have a washing machine. They washed their clothes in the tub, and then they hung them out on the balcony. And then later on, people did get washing machines. So Dugan has this whole thing where he was writing during the time when a lot of people were buying washing machines for the first time. And he was saying that, you can put your money into a washing machine or you can refuse to do that. But people would say that you're crazy to do that. Why would you not want the convenience of a washing machine? And so he uses that as a metaphor, saying that there's a lot of technological things. It's not just technological, it's ideological things that people say are mandatory. You have to have this. You have to believe in this or whatever. But we become tied to them. And if someone says no to having a washing machine, people think that you're crazy. Like, why would you be so backwards as to not want that? And so the application of that comes into when we start to get into like really the high tech world, where we start to get into AI, into biological engineering and things like that, that there might come a group of people that can suddenly say no. And so he says that's when you start to get into the fourth political theory, is when you start to say, like, well, we could actually, if we wanted to, there's no reason why we couldn't have a cul-de-sac where all the kids play with each other again. Where the parents just said, no, you're not going to play video games. You're not going to have this device. You're going to go outside and you're going to do this. It would be very difficult to do, but people could still do that if they wanted to. Everyone misses it, but no one actually wants to go back to it, which is kind of interesting. So I think that, like, when you talk about things you like about Tucker Carlson, those are like the everyday, common day sense kind of things that he says. like he likes fly fishing and things like that. You need to get back to kind of an agrarian localist society. And then there are other things he says that are just conspiracy theories and sound crazy, but that's
Right.
Tucker Carlson. That's who he is. So,
I mean, this is the thing that I really think people have to approximate. And I know that one of the contradictions that I would point out to Marxists is they tend to like capitalist production, capitalist modernity, because it enables you to do things in massive ways. Ironically, what they hate about that is class, but they also kind of admit that social class is necessary for maintaining it. There's no way to run a capitalist society without social class. And I know that most Christians wouldn't, they would not say that social class itself is a problem. It's the treatment between social classes that is a problem. And that's the difference between the Marxist and Christian worldview. But I do find it interesting. I mentioned this. You mentioned one thing about maybe that you thought about me. My father, towards the end of his life, we were kind of estranged. But and he was one of those 70s spiritual jumpers. So he was, I think he was raised Methodist. He discovered he was Jewish, so he became very seriously Jewish for a large part of his life. Then he became a Buddhist, as was often the case in the 70s and early 80s. But he died a Joel Osteen Christian.
okay.
And my response to that was like, man, you picked the most self-flattering form of Christianity.
Yeah.
And while I'm not a Christian, so who am I to adjudicate what is heretical or not? But as I've said to people, both that and also this Jordan Peterson stuff feels like heresy to me, even from a Protestant perspective. So
he's basically Jungian.
Yeah, he's a Jungian.
Carl Jung was a good Catholic Christian, and you could say Jordan Peterson is too. But I was really into Jung. I was a psychology major before I was an English major. I was double majored. Mm-hmm. I was really into Jung at one point, and I came to a point where I was saying it's real interesting as a construct, but if you believe that, you're, one of my college professors knew Carl Jung's daughter, his niece, excuse me, and basically she introduced them to mescaline. Said, "Oh yeah, my uncle used to do mescaline all the time." I was like I'm hearing this for the first time. I'm going like, it doesn't really surprise me, because if you read Jung, he has these ideas that we have race memories, and nobody believes that we have race memories.
Right.
But so but Jordan Peterson does, apparently. So,
well, my favorite thing is Jordan Peterson talk about Christianity, but if you ask him just point blank, does he believe in Judeo-Christian God, he will not answer it positively or negatively. Just like, I believe
that if you took a television camera and went back to Judea in AD 30, could you see Jesus rise from the dead? And he can't answer that question. I can tell you all kinds of things that are wrong with the question, but I would not be a person to say, no, it's just a matter of faith. I would be a person that would say, historically, I believe that without equivocation, that I believe that. If I didn't, I would not be a Christian. I had a heart transplant. And I did not believe that I was going to come out of it. And I came out of that thinking, if I can trust my doctors to take a heart from a person, put it inside of me, keep me alive, and get me into recovery. And if I believe in God, can he raise my body from the dead? I haven't got a big problem with that. It's all your perspective, and what it is a matter of faith, because you have faith in people and you have faith in God. But it's not like a blind faith where I know it seems impossible, but I just believe it. It's more like, yeah, I think God can do that, because he's very big and he can do it. That's how I look at these kind of questions. And I don't think someone like a Jordan Peterson should have a problem answering that question in that manner. So anyway.
Well, I was going to ask you this. One thing I have denoted, and maybe this is I know it's an unpopular opinion on the left, but I have actually said that, like, I would rather deal with religious conservatives if they're sincere and actually religiously literate at all than secular ones, in so much that I know what their community basis is. I know what the things we can share and not share are. I know where the points of compromise are if they are consistent, and I get nobody's consistent. I also will admit that, including all the leftists that I know. But at least there's a common ground of both conflict and also compromise that can be had. Whereas with secular rightists, I have no idea what we could possibly compromise on.
Or were secular rightists who use Christianity to try to endear themselves to their constituency. There's a lot of that. We all know there is. I actually knew a good friend of mine for a while, this guy named Colonel V. Donner. He was not a colonel in the Army. His parents just had a sense of humor. But his first name was actually Colonel. And he was the founder of ACT, which is the American Christian Traditional Values Coalition. Mm-hmm. And that was the forerunner to the moral majority. As a matter of fact, Colonel Donor was in, he's also not a very good donor either, even though he does raise a lot of money. But he was in the original meeting with Paul Weyrich and Jerry Falwell when they founded the moral majority. And then Paul Weyrich had his own group for Catholics. And one of the things that they came up with is that they should not talk about Christian values or biblical values or biblical law, even though they all agreed with that. What they should talk about is family values and traditional values instead. They actually catered the language to appeal to a broader base rather than what they actually believed. And so Donor came to a certain point in his life where he rejected that. He said, he was basically playing games, and he became a little bit more serious. And then since that time, he's kind of gone off into a different direction too. But I thought that was very interesting. That even like the people that founded these movements that, people think are so ferocious, they actually, they tailor them in such a way that they will be palatable. There used to be the bumper sticker, the moral majority is neither. Mm-hmm. And that's actually true. It's like there aren't really that many moral Christians that, want to uphold biblical law in the society. There's not a majority. And the ones that say they're the majority aren't really that moral. And so Colonel Donor actually admitted that later. He was not really living a very pious Christian life. And people who know him well, that's the first thing that they mention about him. So I'm not going to tell you the different things, but he was not living a life that's that pious. And he would admit that himself. So he would joke about it. And I found that very strange at the time because I was sincere and I wanted to believe in this. And so a lot of people would get vision and flake off. I actually wrote a series of articles back and forth with him. We talked about all this stuff, which I thought was very healthy. So,
yeah, I think that's a good point. I like your point about the people who cynically use religion who are secular. I remember realizing that about Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss, major contributor to neoconservatism, and basically was like, well, you take religious beliefs because we're really all good secret liberals. And this is one of the things that, Dugan would be like, yeah, I told you. But you use the religious belief as a maintenance of liberal society, not because you think it's real. In fact, you don't. It's better if you don't think it's real. And you're just doing it for the non-modern dupes, which is most of the population, which again, I find fascinating as an Enlightenment philosophy, because I'm like, well, that does go against the universalism of the Enlightenment right there. But also it's interesting that was a major influence on American conservative thought, including religious American conservative thought, from like the 70s, I'd say, till about probably the end of the Bush administration. And I don't see people having really reckoned with how fundamentally dishonest that is. Like, because it treats your constituency as dupes. It treats the religion as dupes. I would, again, if I was religious, I would view it as not just heresy, but probably idolatry flat out. So I'm very fascinated with the fact that was tolerated by so many political religious thinkers for so long. And I guess maybe, why do you think that is? Because in that sense, I get why Dugan had like contempt for like American Christianity, because he would just see it as a sham.
Well, he has contempt for the Calvinist foundation, which I don't really understand, because I think he just doesn't understand Calvinism that well. Personally, that's what that's kind of a cop-out, sort of. But he says that he likes John Wycliffe, however. But if you understand like what Wycliffe taught, almost everybody who's Protestant sees him as being like this, forerunner of the Reformation as far as his doctrines go. Everything from salvation by faith alone, sola scriptura, the whole thing that Protestants teach. That's all in Wycliffe, and I'm working on a book right now on that kind of brings all of that out. He also likes he doesn't like he mentions in the book briefly. He mentions his disdain for the Methodists and the Dispensationalists, and he kind of almost puts them together. And the Methodists were like completely different. Like John Wesley was slightly maybe a generation before the Dispensationalists came along,
right?
And they're completely different groups. So I think part of it's due to ignorance. And then he says that he likes like Emerson and Thoreau. I like Emerson and Thoreau too. I think that they were heretics, but I can kind of see the influence of like the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards, kind of like the idea that there's an inner light, kind of like the more of the pietistic strain of Christianity. So I think that American Christianity is actually a hybrid of Puritan thought, but also this real experiential revivalism that came out of the Great Awakenings. And I think the Puritans were that, actually. I don't think that they were like these dour, strict Calvinists. I think that they were people that were really sincerely seeking after like this inner peace, the ability to worship God on their own, that type of thing. And there are different types of Puritans too. And they didn't call themselves Puritans either. That's the other interesting thing about them. So I think that he probably needs to understand American Christianity a lot more. And he has said more recently, that if America is going to become a civilization state, that's what it needs to be based on. It's not going to be Orthodox. It's probably not going to be, Roman Catholic, unless we get a lot of Latin immigrants or something like that, which is another possibility. So America has always been a hybrid of different strains of Christianity. We're not really that much like Europe. Europe is very culturally religious, but not pietistically religious. In America, we're very pious and very spiritually religious, but Christians don't want to have that much to do with the culture necessarily. And then when we do, it's a mess. Like you said, people get very confused as to what the role of politics is and that type of thing. That's kind of like this is one of my roles. This is one of my passions, is to try to teach that to people. And so that's where I find Dugan very useful, is that we do need to move out of liberalism into a fourth political theory. We can't go back to what the Puritans were. It's not going to work. But we can look at some of the foundations that they had and embrace those, and then invent something new. One of the things I mentioned to people is that if you were to go back to the time of the founding of America and you tried to describe what the capitalist system was to them, they wouldn't know what you were talking about. And yet that's what we get from American Christians. Oh yeah, the Puritans were capitalists. Well, they weren't actually. And what we have today isn't really capitalism. What we have is kind of like this corporate capitalism where the government it's basically the elite business class and the permanent political class get together and they give lots of money towards big corporation. That's not capitalism. They call it corporate capitalism. You could also call it corporate socialism too. So I think that there are a lot of Christians that are waking up to that now. So this is one of the reasons why Dugan might be relevant, is to say that we can break out of that model and into something else that goes beyond that. If you were to talk to people, in the late Middle Ages, like around the time of the Puritans or William Shakespeare, about Western democracy, they wouldn't know what that is either. Like one of my favorite things to do in Boston, I'm from Framingham, is to go and look at the historical sites. And I remember one time I was talking to a tour guide in Boston, and Faneuil Hall. Faneuil Hall was founded by the Puritans and so on. And this tour guide always asks people, what are the Puritans known for? And she says the most common answer to that question is democracy. And she has to explain to them, no, the Puritans were not a democratic society. They were actually very feudalistic, in the way that they looked at things. So we really have a lot of anachronistic kind of ideas when we look at our own past. And so I think and the thing is that not all of those things were bad. Like there might be, so Dugan would go into something like that. Well, there might be aspects of feudalism that were good that we want to recover. There might be aspects of, these different other systems that we want to go back into and assemble them he calls it the metaphysics of debris.
Mm-hmm.
You know, where you go in and things that were discarded. And then very interestingly, he says, he goes, what was discarded was the chief cornerstone. And he quotes from Isaiah, which is also quoted in the New Testament, where Christ was the stone that was rejected by the builders, the Pharisees, and that he was made into the chief cornerstone of the new temple, which is the church. And so he has that way of, relating his own, metaphysics, his own mystical ideas back to the Bible. He does that consistently over and over again. So that's one of the things I found compelling about it. So, and he doesn't do it in the way the liberals do it either. It's not like they're just patronizing people that believe in the Bible. He actually, I think, does believe this.
Right.
So I think that's one of the questions that you did have, is how much of an Orthodox Christian is Alexander Dugin actually, right? That's one of the things I've heard you talking about.
Right. Yeah, and I've told you I'm not completely sure, but you might have convinced me in like reading over your book that there's probably a lot more to the theological element of it that even some of his fans in America don't understand. Yeah. So I think that's an important thing to point out. You've mentioned two of your critiques of Dugan. I want to ask if there's any more, and I'll just recap them. You agree with him on the ending of liberalism. You agree with him on the rise of civilizational states. You agree with him on...
yeah, I agree with him. I don't know that we know what it's going to look like. I think that we're filtering it through our Marxist view of what a civilization state is. Like a lot of people look at that and they say, well, that's empirism. But I don't think that he uses the word empire sometimes, but he's anti-imperialist. So he doesn't mean it the same way that, that we think of it. So anyway, go on. Sorry.
No. There's a whole debate right now about what is meant by colonial, imperial, and some of these new right thinkers. But I want to ask you, so you agree with those things and you disagree with him. You think he seems historically ignorant of Protestantism and Calvinism in specific.
Right.
I
am a Calvinist, by the way, too. I didn't know if that was clear, but I was in a church for 10 years, one of the leading spokesmen for Calvinism, R.C. Sproul. Mm-hmm. I kind of learned a lot from that, and so.
Yeah. So and I think the other thing you said is some of his critiques of, not that he disagrees with individualites, but some of his critique of individualites is not obvious to people. What are any other things you disagree with him on?
I think that he it's not so much disagreement, but I don't either. I feel like I don't understand what he's trying to say, or that he has an overly like you pointed out, he has an overly simplistic view of the way that American politics are. Mm-hmm. Like I think that the same way we look at Russia, like how is Dugan viewed in Russia, and I have to explain to people Russia is 140 something million people, maybe more now that they've exceeded some territories that people don't want to mention, and that only about 78% of the population is actually Russian. Mm-hmm. That there's 10% of the population is Muslim, and there's 180 different ethnic groups. They're all Russian nationality, but not all of them are Russian ethnicity. And that's another thing that, when people, it's not so much that I would disagree with Dugan on this. It was that I realized that when people read him, they don't understand that what he's talking about when he's talking about ethnicity is not nationalism. It's not ethnic nationalism. He's talking about you could have a culture, you can have a civilization that's monocultural, right? Like America, Americans, I would argue America's culture is Anglo-Saxon Protestant, or was, and that you can't really have a multicultural civilization. What will end up happening when you have multiculturalism, it will be a transition from one monoculture to another. One will win out. If the civilization is going to remain strong, one of them has to win out. And that culture is going to unify people, but there also has to be room for a diversity of ethnicities. Like you have to allow people to come, like Russia's a lot different than America, where these ethnicities have been there forever. They've preceded the Russian culture.
Mm-hmm.
The Russian culture absorbed them, but didn't completely absorb them. And even like during the time in the Soviet Union Russified the people, but they also celebrated these cultures more so
Right.
than the czars did, by the way. And they like wanted people to do their traditional dress, do your festivals, speak your language, teach it in the schools if you want to, that type of a thing. So I was in Tatarstan on 2 of my trips, and half the population there is Tatar. And I was like, well, who are these people? I was in one town where I wouldn't say half, but a good portion of the city was gypsies or Romani people. And there are these little pockets. It's not the majority of the country, but there are these little pockets, little countries within Russia. So so people, I don't say I disagree with Dugan on this, but people think that what he wants is this like homogenized world where like Russia's going to just take over. And he actually doesn't. What he wants is for Russia to be a very strong culture based on Russian Orthodox Christianity, but he wants the Muslim ethnicity to be there. Mm-hmm. And so as a Christian, I kind of like, a lot of my Christian friends and myself, we kind of cringe at that, where, we don't want Muslims to go on forever. We want them to accept Jesus Christ, But one of the things I came to realize, though, is that these people aren't necessarily our enemies, but they could be allies in fighting liberalism. I'm a school teacher in Orlando. I have Muslim students. And so some of my conservative Christian friends think that, all Muslims are jihadists, and once they get to a certain percentage of the population, they're going to declare Sharia law and take over and start killing us all. And I'm going, no, you don't understand who these people are. They're from all over the world. They're from Morocco. They're from Egypt. They're from Africa, different countries. And they came here because they wanted to get out of the country they were in. They wanted to work for a living, make money, and have some freedom. And yes, they might be religious Muslims, but every so often one of them converts to Christianity too, that I run into. And I've met the parents before, and I've gone like, this is the kind of mother that we ought to have in America that really cares about her daughter's education. She's from Morocco, and they they wear the head coverings and all of that. But it's like, I wish all my students had mothers like that. Because we've become so liberal that it's like, well, the parents are not like that in charge of their kids anymore. Kids have rights, and in these families, it's like, no, I've had Asian kids complain about that too. You don't understand, Mr. Archer. I can't get a C in your class. I have an Asian parent. Well, that's good. That's good. I wish, we all had Asian parents, so I think that's one of the keys to that. These traditional cultures bring strengths with them that are compatible with a Christian conservative worldview, even if they're not that, so.
Yeah. I think that's important. I mean, from the standpoint of a lot of my audience, it's important that people hear this, for example, that you're not a flaming xenophobe. And
no, my wife's from Venezuela. So as a matter of fact, I did enough missions trips where I decided I got married fairly late, like when I was in my late 30s. And so I was like, one wife, one time. And I decided like, I have a very high chance of getting divorced because, divorce is in my family. I'm going to marry the right person. Who do I want to marry? And the first thought that came to my mind was not an American, not an American Christian evangelical, but a religious person from another country. And she might even have to be Catholic, which my wife is. So we don't have the same theological beliefs, and we disagree on a lot of stuff, but we have the same values. Mm-hmm. And so having the same values is cohesive. So that's very much Duganism right there. That's, you have the same values, and we can exist in a multipolar world like that with other civilizations with other values, but we're going to be separate from them because of religion and ideology and culture and language and things like that. But so we can admire them and learn from them. So Huntington would argue that too, although Huntington was less optimistic than Dugan is about it.
Right, yeah. Huntington thought that civilizational states mean that there's basically constant civilizational war. But yeah.
He said that it's in the back of his book, as a matter of fact. If I can grab it, I had it somewhere over here. He said that that civilization, I'm going to paraphrase, it says civilizational states pose one of the greatest dangers, but also one of the greatest potentials for having a stable world too. Like it's dangerous when they clash, but if you can build them and keep them apart, then it can become more stable in the long run. So a lot of people misunderstand Huntington too, I think, that way. So he wasn't
Well, I do think Huntington was also like read very specifically in a very specific time period, in the aughts, in a way that actually is very different than, like, if you were to read Huntington's book and remove it from the context of like when I was coming up in the 90s and aughts, and read it when it was actually written in the 86, he thought the major civilizational conflict was going to be against a culture that he respected, actually, but he thought was dangerous, and that was Chinese culture. Like, that was Huntington's big concern. Funnily enough, we seem to have gone back full circle, but now people don't read it. Well, I think I've read that The Clash of Civilizations is the most assigned book in college.
Yes, but at one time it was, yes.
Yeah.
Well, it was like, if you look at syllabuses, it would be up there with like Machiavelli and Plato. It was there. And the reason why is because he was a Harvard professor.
Right. So. But I also feel like it's one of those books like Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and the Last Man that everyone references, but no one's actually read.
Right. They don't understand that it's actually negative toward the end and so on. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, you've heard me talk about that. You straightened me out on that, by the way. I thought that he was all in favor of it, and I realized like he wasn't necessarily. He was saying this is the way it is, but if you listen to Fukuyama now, he's still alive. He's a raving neocon.
Yep.
So it's he does believe that.
It's interesting.
Charles Krauthammer said when he first wrote about this in the 1989 essay, he said, the unipolar world shall be brief. And then he was like, well, I'll give it another 20 years. And then he was advocating for continuing it. And it did last another 20 years. He was right. But we do see it's breaking down too. So, I mean, Huntington was wrong on his specifics, but I think his general thesis is correct. That there has never really been a unipolar world. If you go back
not
before
very long, no.
If you went back before the 1500s, it was impossible because we didn't know what the other side of the world looked like. People didn't know Japan, for instance, in 1500.
Right.
We knew China, but not that many people. Now you can go online and talk to Chinese people, so that's interesting too. So I think that's one of the things that people are going to say, like, well, we could all become this homogenized global village. We have a choice to go in that direction. But I think increasingly people go, no, culture is important to me. My language is important to me. We're not just going to all. I was in Holland, the Netherlands, in 1997, and then again in 2017. Right, 20 years apart. And I went to a friend's wedding. And when I got there, I could get along because most people spoke English and I speak some German. So I was able to go on. Now everybody speaks English. So I asked my friend's kids who were born after she got married, were teenagers. I said, "Why is that?" It's like you have to know English to be on computers. So that's one of the things that Vladimir Putin and Chairman Xi and other people said. We need to separate ourselves from Google. We need to separate us from. We need to have our in Russia. No one's on Facebook. They have their own version of Facebook. It's called VK. I forget what it stands for, but it's basically based around people that you went to high school with. That's how you get started, and then it's like circles like that. And I'm on it just because I have Russian friends that are on it, and I don't understand. It doesn't have an auto translate on it, so I don't understand half of what they're saying, but it's interesting. So that's part of that idea. You can have different worlds and still be connected technologically, but as we go forward, people are going to want to preserve something, And you see that a lot. And one of the things I wrote about in my book was the different movies that have come out. Like there was an Indian movie called, I'm trying to remember what it was called, but it's a movie about Indian nationalism. It was the most popular movie in India. It was the #1 movie on Netflix for a while. And basically it's about these two Indian nationalists. They overthrow the colonialists and the animals fight for them. It's like this epic, really well done movie. there was a movie done in Russia. It was the second most expensive movie ever made in Russia. It was called Viking, and it's about 988 and about the Novgorod princes and how Kiev was converted and all of that. And you don't know the movie is going to be about Christianity until the very end, when Vladimir he converts and they get baptized and everything. So there are these different movements where people are, I think that the popularity of Mel Gibson in the 90s and 2000s is a good example of that too. Where he had Braveheart and the Patriot. People are kind of drawn to their roots. So that is definitely happening, and you see it a lot in the arts and in churches and places like that. In politics, not so much, but culturally, you see it.
Well, Jay, thank you so much for your time. Where can people find your work?
Basically, just go to Amazon and type in Jay Rogers. I have a book called The Fourth Political Theory and Biblical Perspective. And then I have a lot of other books on postmillennial eschatology and things like that. I have a book on Nero, which is kind of interesting if people want to read about that. Why Nero is the beast of Revelation. But the book specifically on the fourth political theory and biblical perspective, you can go on Amazon. And what I'm going to do is I am going to, in the coming months, break it down into 3 separate books. One on Dugan, one on Huntington, and one on Ray Dalio, which we did not get to talk about. But he's interesting too.
Yeah, I would tell you that I would suggest you break it down. I actually did find your book fascinating and pretty well written. And even though, like I said, we're probably not going to agree on a whole lot of base things, I thought it was a pretty good book.
Thank you.
But it is long.
And I did one book on Daniel that was 700 pages too.
Okay.
And taking a postmillennial view on it. And people told me, you make it shorter. So I made a shorter version, but people still want to buy the long book, And so this one is it's not, it's not, about publishing books. It's not that easy. My Daniel book has done the best out of all of them. I'm kind of shocked at it. It's not like a runaway bestseller or anything, but I'm shocked that people buy it frequently. The Dugan book, the Fourth Political Theory and Biblical Perspective book is probably number 4 or 5 out of the ones I've done. I have 10 books total, depending on what you call a book. So,
all right.
So you can just go to Amazon, Jay Rogers, and type in my name, and you'll see who I am very easily. So,
all right. Well, thank you so much, and I hope my audience gets some insight into why an American conservative Protestant Christian might be interested in Dugan. Have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.